So after what seems like an eternity, I finally managed to complete the build of this Range Rover, which I dubbed the Miyagi Range Rover, simply because I chose the Mr. Miyagi action figure to be the driver in this specific truck. It started off as a project to see if I could make myself a very good handling Range Rover, where the first Range Rover that I built was based off an Axial SCX10.2. The limitations with the scale tires, the higher center of gravity, generally did not lend itself that well to a vehicle that could really perform. This specific vehicle is one which I based on a VS410. I had no preconceived ideas as to what components were going to be put onto this vehicle, but I did ultimately decide that I wanted to do something which was my version of a portal-driven Range Rover for a relative low center of gravity to just make sure that this vehicle had more stability when out on the trail. Again, it's not going to be an incredibly competent crawler, but it had to have a degree of competency. I essentially decided that I would build this vehicle utilizing the VS410 basic chassis. It was not a VS410 Pro, a VS410 Ultra, or an Origin, but it shared a lot of the components from all of these vehicles. The only difference between this and a VS410 Ultra, if I was to really look at it, is the non-use of a VFD transmission, but rather in this specific case, using the very overbuilt version of an Axial SCX10 basic transmission, using all the catalog bits available in the Vanquish catalog. And this then meant that the car has a dig, it's got everything I want. The shocks are not Vanquish shocks, they are shocks by Pitbull, the chronic model of shocks. Wanted to just see what they're like, but everything else is pretty much been adapted to see what would work with this specific shell. It wasn't the easiest, but it wasn't the hardest project that I've done. We're now pretty much where all the mechanicals are working. We can now get onto the more fine details as to how we're actually going to cover up some of the mechanicals internally within the body shell and just make this look better. I'm also looking to put some lights, etc. So with that, I'll take the body shell off now so that we can just have a look and see what's underneath this. In order to take this shell off, there are 4 screws that we have that protrude through the floorboard of this body shell. And these are bolted down. I've already taken the small bolts out. You can see these bolts here. The body itself just lifts off as such. The chassis was chosen because it has a pretty low center of gravity already, using the transmission from the original Axial SCX10 design, but totally rebuilt using all Vanquish parts. So you can see in this specific situation here, this car does not use any axial parts, with the exception of the springs, the bolt, and the 2 slipper side discs. Other than that, everything else on this car, including everything internally within the transmission, is actually Vanquish. Whether or not you call this a Vanquish, whether or not you call this an SCX10, whether you call this a VS410 Ultra with an axial transmission, I have no idea. I chose this because I like the idea of the transmission sitting low with a battery up front, which was needed in this specific case, given that the body shell itself needs to have clearance in the rear part for the flatbed and the interior. I wanted to make sure I could use the interior on this specific chassis. If you look at the cutting that needed to be done to the specific body shell in order to clear all the parts of the chassis that I wanted, 1, very large tires as compared with what this Range Rover body shell is made for, 2, a lower suspension, and 3, the fact that it was going to sit on a Vanquish chassis. The first things that needed to be done was much larger cut to the arches, which in turn required buying some wheel arches. And these wheel arches came from Loops, if I remember correctly, and they are very specific in that they not only push out, but they provide for a much larger arch front and rear. This also allowed me to do a much bigger cut into the arches in the front and rear, and you can see that there was a lot of cutting required here and in the rear here as well. The amount of cutting required did not affect the integrity of the strength. At the same time, there was a lot of other cutting required to this body shell. Obviously, the rear portion to allow for the shocks to come through, as well as the receiver box, the central transmission. For the spur gear, I needed to cut the center console out. I also needed to do substantial cutting to the dashboard and the floorboard here to allow for the battery to sit forward. All of that was in an attempt to make sure that this shell would sit exactly on a VS410 chassis with an axial transmission. Again, the combination of that chassis chosen because there was a forward battery position that allowed for the flatbed to sit further down, a transmission that pushed the motor further below the central transmission as compared with an Axial SCX10.2 2-speed transmission that I had in my first Range Rover, and the bigger tires that in turn provide for more crawling ability. You can see down here that we've got the fully built transmission. I've also got the dig installed, and this is a dig that comes straight out standard for an Axial SCX10 transmission. In this case, in order to fit it to the VS410 chassis, I was required to cut the rear support brace somewhat in order to clear that servo. In addition to that, I had to use these sliders, and these sliders here were modified to allow me to put the body shell on and off the chassis with relative ease. The battery sits nicely up front, which was as standard for the VS410 chassis kit. In the very front, I've also put the ESC as well as the servo. We're running Curry portals. The slipper clutch in this case may go, and I may just put in a solid axle. There was also some clearance issues in relation to the MIP shafts, so I had to do some grinding and machining. Finally got them to fit in terms of length, etc. as well. That was a bit of a headache, finding the right distance, or rather the right length of shafts front and rear. And as you can see, this fella's not been run at all. So other than running it around the living room, making sure the dig works, making sure that everything else works, the truck itself is pretty much brand new. I look forward to actually taking it out, and I will do so very soon. And when I do it, I will make sure that I take some videos as well so that you all can see this truck in action. Just another quick update just so that you all would see this vehicle now as it finally stands. And I do hope that you all enjoyed getting the update on the Miyagi Range Rover. And I look forward to making this fella actually do some climbing and getting a bit dirty in the next video. Take care.